friends are since.
Hello and welcome to the third video in my series of tutorials for the Dirtywave M8. If you're brand new to the M8 or to LSDJ, then it might be worth going back to watch the older ones I've done, because I have gone through the basics of the screen and the workflow from scratch, given some tips and tricks for song structure and stuff like that, as well as looking at tables, which are quite complicated but also very powerful and one of the key features of the M8 and one which people ask about quite a lot. For this video though, I'm going to be looking at something which in practice is pretty straightforward, but if you haven't seen it before, then it might be fairly mystical, and that is live mode. Now obviously with the M8 we've got song mode, which is where you write your composition out and play through it in a linear fashion in this kind of blocky style, but one of the big challenges of playing electronic music live is finding a way to have more control over the music and be able to perform rather than just pressing start on a track and letting it run through to the end. And in most tracker software, you're fairly limited in what you can do with live performance and kind of live changes. But this is where the live mode comes in handy, or at least really shines. Taken directly from LSDJ, the live mode in the M8 allows you to trigger chains or clips, depending on how you want to think about it, from this main song screen. And it does so in a manner that is not too dissimilar to Ableton. If you want to think about it like that, that might help you figure out what it's doing. I've got my hardware M8 hooked up here. I'm recording it on my screen so you can see what's going on, and I'm going to put a wee diagram down here of the buttons to show you what I'm talking about, because I'm still stuck in the Game Boy mindset where the buttons have got different names, and so forgive me if I get mixed up, but hopefully the diagram below will be accurate and I won't have to be so careful with my words. It's hard to shake off decades worth of calling something else. So in practice, how does this work? Well, you enter live mode by pressing shift and left together, and you can see on the screen here that it tells you how to escape live mode should you need to do so. You basically do the same thing, and this is really helpful actually, because in LSDJ, if you weren't familiar with it and you didn't know what live mode was, you could find yourself there by accident quite easily, and it wasn't obvious how you get out of it, and so having this visual prompt is actually quite nice, so thanks for that. There's a few different ways that you can start your tune. You can either do it in song mode and then switch to live mode like this, or you can start the individual pattern or row that you want to play. Now to start an entire row at once, you hold down left and then press play or start if you're from the Game Boy era. And you can jump between anywhere in the composition. Or of course you can always just start individual chains and pick whatever ones you want. You can mix and match things that way, and it'll just continue down the song as you've set it up. To stop a chain from playing, you highlight it with your cursor and then you press shift and play. You'll see a negative sign and that will cause it to stop playing. So for example, here's a negative sign, so this one will stop. And you can also do that to more than one at once. Easy enough. Now you'll have noticed there that the chains don't start immediately when you select them. They wait until the end of the particular chain before moving on to the next one that you've queued up. So if you've got a chain like this one, which has got 4 phrases in it, it will wait till the end of the 4 phrases are done before moving on. And the same as this, there's 8 in here, so it'll wait till the end of the 8th phrase is done before moving on. However, you might not always want the queue to work this way. You might want the thing you've queued to start at the end of the phrase you're on, rather than waiting for the end of the full chain. And to do this, you just select it and hit the play button twice. Now you'll see the arrow flashing quickly, and that indicates that it'll now change at the end of the phrase, which is handy. So for example, you can jump between them. You can do this with full rows as well, and this is something that I used to use a lot when playing live with LSDJ, is it's quite a good way to snap everything back into time, especially if you've got phrases of different lengths or chains of different lengths. It means you can kind of reset everything. The one caveat there is that if you've got phrases with different grooves or different kind of speeds, so different time signatures, that won't work in the same way because they're all running at slightly different speeds and things get messed up. So be aware of that if you're a creative time signature person. That won't be as useful. The other way you can manipulate or customize the quantization though is on a global basis, and you do that by going into the project screen, and you can see here that we've got live quantize, and by default it's set to chain length, but you can also set it to steps, and that means that you can basically quantize things to any kind of multiplication or division of a phrase that you want. You could have it half a phrase, you could have it quarter of a phrase, you know, whatever kind of thing you can dream up. And if you're a mathematical type person, then that means you can do all sorts of crazy shit with this, I'm sure. But I'm a simple man, and so I like to stick with chain length and the double tap for the quicker transition. Now, when you start playing a row or chain within the usual kind of linear song layout that you can see here, the playhead will continue to move through the rows of the song as you've set it up. But for a live performance, you probably want to have a bit more control over things than that, so that you can loop a certain melody or section of your track and choose when to move on to the next section. And for this reason, we need to structure our song a bit differently for live performance. So if I scroll up here, you'll see that I've got each row, or kind of each section of the song put together with blank lines separating them out. And this means that when I trigger this row or any of the individual chains within, it will just keep playing this section without moving on, like this. You'll note that when it gets to here and to the end of this row, I'll just go back to this and just loop through in that manner. Of course, I can also mix and match my chains between or pick an entirely new part of the song. Very nice. Now you'll note that I've got these FE chains in here and they're marked in red, and that is because they're blank. So even though they've got phrases in here, there's no notes or anything in them, and they're just being used as placeholders, so that if, for example, in this section of the song, on this particular part, I wanted to have something play but nothing play here, the blank chains basically just keep things in sync so that they're ready to come in whenever without me having to trigger them manually. And all of this kind of underlines the benefit of having a logical approach to numbering and structuring your chains, because it makes it way easier to perform things or get the most out of live mode. And if you aren't sure what I'm talking about, then I've given some tips on how I structure things and my kind of numbering logic on my other M8 intro video that's linked here somewhere, and it's worth going back to watch that because it does help you when you're playing to kind of navigate and figure out what's going on. There are some other commands within the M8 that apply equally in song mode to live mode, but they are particularly useful for live mode, so I'm going to mention them just now. First of all, muting. While playing, you can mute individual channels by holding down the option button and pressing shift, and that will mute the track that you've got selected, for example. Now, depending on what button you release first, the mute will either be momentary or latching. So if you release shift first, it will unmute the channel, but if you release option first, the mute will stay in place until you do the same thing in reverse. So it's quite hard to explain that, or at least it's harder to explain than it is to do in practice. So if you play about with it, you'll see what I mean. You can also do the same thing with multiple tracks at once. Similar to muting, you can also solo channels by selecting the one or ones that you want and then pressing option and start instead of shift, or option and play I should say. And this behaves the same way as the mute command in terms of the momentary or latching nature. For example, another cool trick with soloing is that if you select a particular channel, hold down option and then press left or right, all of the channels in that direction will be soloed, whereas the other ones will be muted. So now this means that if you set up your channels in a kind of logical way with your percussion on one side and your melody on the other, then you can kind of drop in and drop out bits. So almost like a mute group kind of thing, which is quite handy to bring it in and out whole chunks of your arrangement without having to set up a whole new kind of row system. One thing to note is that this function does not have a latching feature, so it will stop when you take your finger off the arrow key unlike the other two that I've just spoken about. If you find yourself stuck with tons of different solos and mutes set up and you don't know what to do, a quick way to clear it all is to press Option, Shift and Play all at once. That's a wee bit of an unusual combination because you have to kind of like, you know, do this to do it, but it can be done as a kind of panic button mode if you don't know what to do to get out of it all. Now, maybe you don't give a shit about playing live, and that's perfectly understandable, but the lessons we've learned from live mode carry into other areas quite nicely, and the first is in just general song composition. Because trackers are quite detailed and, you know, they've got lots of depth about them, you often want to change lots of things per step, and to do that, you need to keep kind of looping the same section over and over again while you change things to see how it sounds, and that is kind of how I write my songs in LSDJ or in the M8. Initially, I just set it up in this kind of live blocky fashion so that I can loop things, try different things out, and using live mode I can bring in different phrases and combine different chains with other ones very easily without having to structure it all out first. And then once I've got an idea of how I want things to work, I can then go in and structure them and put them in down here. So that's what I tend to do, and it makes the creation process so much easier, but it also means that if I do come to play live later, then I don't have to do a lot of work of, you know, breaking out the different chains and things, which is pretty handy. Now, the second thing you can do with live mode, which you can't really do as easily with song mode, is to create chains and phrases of different lengths that you can then just let run free and overlap and get all these wonderfully interesting melodies and polyrhythmical things. And so I've got a song that I will show you. This song is called Spell Temple. I originally wrote this on LSDJ a long time ago, and recently I redid it. I've got a video somewhere where I re-recorded it, and I've started redoing it in the M8 here. And you'll see that I've only got a wee bit of it done because it's quite labour intensive to do, to be honest. But in here, each of these chains, or most of the chains, sorry, have got different lengths. So this one's got 6 different phrases, this one's got 5, this one's got 2, this one's got 4, and so on. And basically, I've just let them kind of run and overlap, and you can see that it starts to do some pretty interesting things. Now, you might be wondering, you're in song mode, so what's that got to do with live mode? And the benefit of using live mode for this kind of thing is that whilst this works fine in song mode, having it just loop round and round like this, if you wanted to move on to a different part of the song, it then becomes trickier because you have to kind of realign everything and get everything to start playing in time again. And you can do it. It means though you have to kind of set phrases up in a certain way to make sure it all lines up. And it's just much easier to do that in live mode because essentially all you would do is you would have another section of the song here, for example, and then you would just cue it up and it would start playing and everything would be in time. Unlike, you know, in song mode where you'd have to kind of fiddle about with the phrase lengths and whatever else. So that is one big benefit of using live mode. And if you're interested in poly, I don't really understand the terms, this is very interesting to do. So that's it. That's kind of my tutorial on live mode. Hopefully it's useful or informative. I may well have missed some things out. I'm still getting used to live mode on the M8 as opposed to LSDJ. And even in LSDJ, the controls and stuff in live mode have changed over the years. So I've been trying to figure out the differences between them because there are some differences between the M8 and older LSDJ versions and stuff. So if you're coming from 4.7.3 on LSDJ, for example, things might not be 100% as you expect, which was my my experience. But anyway, if you've got other tips for live mode that I haven't covered, please let me know because I do use it frequently and I'd be glad to know. The other thing is, if there are particular things on the M8 that you want to see more of, maybe you're looking to buy one but you're unsure and you're waiting eagerly for the next batch to be available, but you don't quite understand everything yet or whatever, then let me know and I'll endeavour to do more stuff. For now, that's kind of it. So thanks for watching and go watch all my other videos so that I become an internet fucking superstar. Goodbye.